All right, everybody. Today we are going to be discussing post-World War II politics in Minnesota. And basically everything kind of happening during World War II to right after, right at the turn of the 21st century. And because we're short on time, we'll be focusing on probably the most essential people and events that occurred in that 50, 60-year time period. The first person to talk about is Harold Stassen. Now, he was a Republican who was going to defeat Elmer Benson in the 1938 election for governor. And he was the youngest governor of all time in Minnesota, still is. He was elected at age 31. And he's going to run on an idea that he called enlightened capitalism. And this idea of enlightened capitalism is going to kind of lay the groundwork for a lot of Republicans being elected in Minnesota in years to come after this. And essentially what enlightened capitalism was is it was still a progressive movement. It was progressive just like Floyd B. Olson had been in the 30s, and Elmer Benson and other Farmer Labor Party members and other other people in Minnesota, other politicians. But with this, he called it, this was an idea where he was going to be supportive of many of FDR's New Deals, just like previous governors, where not all Republican governors in other states were. And so he says, yeah, we're still going to do these things. We can just run them better. And so there was some cost cutting, and taxes were lowered and things like that, and people liked it. And so he became very, very popular. And he's elected again in 1940. He's elected again in 1942. But he resigns in 1943 to become to go join the war. And he serves in the Navy, I think, as like a secretary of the Navy, so very high up, or assistant secretary or something like that. And when World War II is over with, one of the things that is being put together is the United Nations. And President Harry Truman at the time selects Harold Stassen to be one of the United States' representatives in forming the United Nations. And so he does sign the original charter. He was the last living member that signed that original charter when he passed away in, I think, 2001 or 2 or something like that. And so here's this, young, energetic guy. He's done a lot of things already. And at that point, people are kind of picking him like, this could be a guy that becomes president of the United States someday. And he does run for president 9 times. The first time he runs was probably his best opportunity, which was in 1952. And in 1952, he was kind of the early front runner until Dwight D. Eisenhower, World War II hero and general, decides to run. And at that point, Stassen endorses Eisenhower. Now, he does run in primaries for years to come. He ends up running 9 total times, and he never comes out as out of the primary as the successful Republican candidate. But he just kept running. The next person we'll talk about is Hubert Humphrey, probably Minnesota's most impactful politician of the 20th century, maybe our most famous, as far as like who's actually in a history book, that type of thing. And probably what he should be known for is the civil rights movement. Going back all the way to 1948, he gave a speech about civil rights at the Democratic National Convention. And that kind of sparked a lot of the Southern Democrats to kind of start leaving the party and eventually switching over to the Republican Party down the road. But he was a senator from Minnesota first he was a mayor of Minneapolis, and then he became a senator from 1948 to 1964, and then again a senator from 1971 to 1978. And in that first stretch from 48 to 64, one of the big things he pushed was civil rights. In 1964, he was selected as Lyndon Johnson's vice president. After President Kennedy was shot and killed in 63, basically Lyndon Johnson becomes president and tells Humphrey, let's get the Civil Rights Act passed. And so we're talking, monumental stuff, Civil Rights Act, segregation is ending, that type of stuff. And so he's a big part of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act of the 1960s. He runs for president in 1968. Lyndon Johnson decides not to. At that time, Vietnam War was very, very unpopular. And so Johnson decides not to run for president again. And Humphrey decides to run. And he does become the Democratic candidate. And probably his downfall is that he does not really disapprove of Vietnam. He continues to support Lyndon Johnson with the Vietnam War. And that most likely is what costs him the election. And he loses to Richard Nixon, who many of you have probably heard about. And it was a pretty tight race. You look over here at the total votes, and 73 million votes were cast, and 31.7 million were cast for Nixon, and 30.8 million were cast for Humphrey. And what's going to also hurt Humphrey is these southern states that had been primarily Democratic because of the civil rights and everything. They were switching over, and they end up voting for Wallace, who had been the governor of Alabama, and his famous line was segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. So they really didn't care for Humphrey at this point. Humphrey ends up, when he becomes senator again, he ends up dying in office of cancer in 1978. A few years later in Minnesota, we built the Metrodome, and some of you might remember the Metrodome, and it was called the Hubert H. Humphrey Metrodome, named after him. At the end, I'll have a link about a news story from his funeral, but a very impactful politician from Minnesota. Another politician at the same time that lived during the same time as Humphrey and would have known him very well is Orville Freeman. And he became a governor of Minnesota from 1955 to 1961. And he, along with Humphrey, were two of the guys that helped form the DFL when you had the Farmer Labor Party and the Democratic Party, and they merged together. So he became the Secretary of Agriculture under both Kennedy and Johnson from 1961 to 1969. So you had two guys over there working in the White House, one as the Secretary of Ag and one as the Vice President, both from Minnesota. One of the lasting impacts that was created by Orville Freeman while he was Secretary of Agriculture is the food stamp program, which is still around today. Roy Wilkins, he grew up in St. Paul. He went to the University of Minnesota. He was a writer. He was part of the newspaper there. And eventually, though, he's going to rise up the ranks of the NAACP. And he was the executive secretary and executive director of the NAACP from 1955 to 1977. And when you think about that time period, going back to modern America in 10th grade, this is when all those major civil rights events are happening. You know, from Emmett Till to the Little Rock Nine, to the, Birmingham and Selma, the March on Washington, and all these things are happening while Roy Wilkins is one of the leading figures in the NAACP and kind of helping lead some of these protests. And he was very much a voice of reason during that time period as well. And really is an important figure of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, and sometimes is kind of forgotten. Is when you think about that time period, you think of Martin Luther King Jr., maybe you think of Malcolm X, and especially maybe some of JFK, but Roy Wilkins definitely should be remembered. Some of you may have been up to the Roy Wilkins Auditorium. They've got some nice stuff outside of that. The Xcel Energy Center is kind of over here to the right, but this is a big auditorium. The state gymnastics tournament is there every year, and you can kind of see in here there's seating, but there's concerts that take place in there and other things. And then you have the up at the University of Minnesota. Some of you might go there. You might be in the dorm there, Roy Wilkins Hall. named after him. Now, post-World War II, politics in Minnesota wasn't really dominated by Republicans or Democrats. It flips back and forth between the two. And when you look at how they voted for president, essentially from post-World War II to 1972, Minnesotans voted 4 times for a Democrat and 3 times for a Republican. So split pretty good. And then you look at governorship, they voted 7 times for a Republican and 3 times for a Democrat. So the Republicans, statewide had more power than Democrats probably did during this time period. And just kind of look throughout the years, Truman, a Democrat, wins Minnesota in 48. And then Eisenhower is going to win Minnesota in 52 and 56. In 1960, Kennedy, a Democrat's going to win. And then also Johnson is going to win in 64. And then Humphrey from Minnesota is going to win in 1968. Now, that might not have happened had he not been from here. And then you can see Nixon is going to win in 1972. And so split pretty evenly throughout the years. That's going to kind of change because this was the last time in 72 that Nixon, or that a Republican is going to win the presidency in Minnesota. Walter Mondale. And the other thing I wanted to point out is you look at our electoral votes. It's based on population. Back in 1948, we had 11 electoral votes. Now our population has continued to rise. It's just in other states, it's risen faster than in Minnesota. And so even looking at like the Dakotas over here, they've lost votes over the years as well. In Minnesota, we're at 10, and now they're talking we might be at 9 for the next election. The next famous politician from Minnesota is Walter Mondale, and he had been a senator from 1964 to 1976, and he actually, I think he takes over for Humphrey in 64 when Humphrey becomes the vice president. And in 1976, Walter Mondale is chosen to be Jimmy Carter's vice president. So he is the second vice president selected for Minnesota. He was born in Minnesota in a little town called, I think it's pronounced Ceylon. It's down on the Iowa border. But he's vice president from 76 to 1980 with Jimmy Carter. And they are both still alive. They're both in their 90s. And then in 1984, or this is in 78, you can see Ronald Reagan's going to, or 1980, sorry, Ronald Reagan's going to defeat Carter for presidency, but Carter does win a few states. And then 4 years later, Mondale's going to run against Reagan, and Mondale doesn't win any states except Minnesota. So talk about one of the most lopsided races in history. Reagan beats Mondale pretty good, and Minnesota votes for, of course, our own Walter Mondale from here, but that was about it. The next kind of famous guy is Wendell Anderson, who was another guy that was being picked to possibly become, a future president, maybe. Like he was on the fast track. He was a former golfer, hockey player, former Olympian, won the silver medal. And he's known for what they called the Minnesota Miracle and the Minnesota Massacre that we'll talk about in a second. But he was young, energetic. People liked him. One of the main problems leading up to when he took over in 1971 was really high property taxes throughout the state. And that's how they were primarily paying for schools and local governments, is with property taxes. And so what they decide to do is decrease property taxes, but they increase sales tax. And I think they increased the sales tax from 3% to 4% in Minnesota. And the big tax was what they called the sin tax. And they taxed this on alcohol and tobacco. And I think what the tax was like, they taxed alcohol 25%. In tobacco, I think they said like a pack of cigarettes or something got taxed like $4 or no, it wouldn't have been that high back then. Maybe 4% or something like that. I can't remember what it was, 4 cents, but that paid for a lot of stuff. And they used that money that was taken in. It all went to St. Paul, to the government, the state government, and then they would equally kind of distribute it throughout the state. So where you used to have these really poor school districts where maybe, people didn't make that much money, they started to get increased aid, and that really improved our schools throughout the state. And so they went from schools only receiving 40% of state money, they started to get 65%. And this also increased aid to local governments. Meanwhile, people were happy because their property taxes were going down. And they called this the Minnesota Miracle. I thought I had a nice picture there. Oh, must not have put it on there. Anyway, in 1976, Mondale goes from senator to vice president. Now, when that happens, it's up to the governor to choose who he wants to become to replace him as a senator. There's not an election until the next time around. And so they kind of come up with a plan. Wendell Anderson decides to resign as governor. His lieutenant governor, Rudy Perpich, an Iron Ranger, becomes governor and then moves Wendell Anderson to the Senate spot. And people are like, hey, that's kind of shady. We don't really like that. And the next time around, voters remembered that. And they end up voting out pretty much all Democrats that year. They lose the 2 Senate races, they lose the governorship, everybody's out. And that became known as the Minnesota Massacre. Perpich, though, does rebound. He's not done. Wendell Anderson kind of disappears. He goes back to being a lawyer for some company. But Rudy Perpich, he's from the Iron Ranger, or he's from the Iron Range, and he's gonna go from governor in 76, but he loses 78. He's gonna be elected again in 1983 until 1991. And he was known as Governor Goofy a little bit because some of the strange ideas he came up with, but he also was very important in promoting Minnesota on an international stage. This is something that's very normal today, but was newer back then, where we want our businesses to start doing business across the globe. And we want people maybe from across the globe, other countries, investing in Minnesota. And he's promoting Minnesota around the world. He also brings the premiere of the Soviet Union to Minnesota in 1990. Mikhail Gorbachev comes here and comes to our state, meets with some of our business leaders. And probably what he maybe should be most remembered for today is laying the groundwork to bring Mall of America to Minnesota. Senator Paul Wellstone, known for traveling around on the green bus, but really what, as far as like history is concerned, he dies in a plane crash in 2002. So he was a pretty popular senator, former professor, I think, at Carleton College. And on the campaign trail, so I think it was late summer, probably August or September, his plane crashes up by Eveleth on the Iron Range. And he and his wife and the pilot and his daughter all died in the plane crash up there in the woods. And then lastly, the last major thing to talk about is Jesse Ventura. And he kind of brings us full circle, all the way back to when we first started talking about politics and we first started talking about the third parties in Minnesota. Jesse Ventura is going to run as a third party. And he's going to run for governor, and he's going to defeat both Norm Coleman and Skip Humphrey, the son of Hubert Humphrey. And he's going to win the governorship in 1999. And what made him famous is that he was a former all-star wrestler, in the 80s and early 90s. Jesse the Body Ventura. He was a former actor, or kind of still is, I guess. But he had been in some big movies, not the main guy, but he had been in things like Predator with Arnold Schwarzenegger and things like that. So he was well known. And he wins this election, and you're going to see a video kind of on how he won it. But he as governor, did some things like enact some property tax reform. He gave some of the money back, like when we had surpluses, he sent people checks. They called them Jesse checks. But really what he's probably most known for is the light rail. He kind of lays the groundwork for the light rail in Minneapolis being built, which is still being expanded today. He was also a guy that had problems with the media. Didn't get along with them very well. But he was governor for 4 years. And I'll have a link to this for you to watch now that we're done.